Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. I'm Emmanuel, I'm a Boeing 737 pilot and a member of PMDG's tech team. In today's video we are going to talk about the visual approach. Now you'll be like, but it's a visual approach, what can be so complicated that it requires its own tutorial? But stay tuned, you're going to be surprised how complex it can actually become. But let's start with the basics. By definition, a visual approach is an approach where either part of or all of an instrument approach procedure is not completed and the approach is executed with visual reference to the terrain. And the general concept behind it is that a visual approach is normally carried out because there is no approach procedure for that runway, or a time saving can be achieved by carrying out a visual approach as opposed to a long protracted arrival and approach procedure. Now we are currently approaching Pescara Airport here, and as you can see, it is quite a long arrival. And if we're looking out into the direction of the destination airport, there is not a lot of terrain here, or basically nothing that would warrant flying such a long arrival, while the weather is actually close to perfect. So let's consider doing a visual approach out of this one. Now, at this position where we are right now, it would probably be too late to decide on a visual approach already, but the decision would normally be made a lot earlier in the flight so that you can properly prepare the visual approach. The biggest threat for the visual is of course controlled flight into terrain, because there is hardly any electronic guidance available, so mishandling of the aircraft followed by crashing into terrain is the one big issue on visual approaches. And to mitigate for that, in my airline, it is actually standard procedure that the FMC needs to be programmed for the visual approach track that you plan to follow, and then the use of the autoflight director system should be maximized during the approach. So there are two methods of entering the visual approach into your FMC, and I'm going to show you both of them. The first one is actually the preferred one, and that is using an established instrument approach procedure. Like in this case, we have the ILS approach for runway 22, and then amending that procedure for the visual approach. And the big benefit of that is that you are going to have missed approach guidance available from the FMC. So, if we're looking at this, we generally do not want to intercept the final approach course at less than 4 miles. So 4 miles shall be the minimum for all our visual approaches. So let's quickly edit the FMC for this 4-mile final. If we have an approach entered like we do right now, then we can simply take the runway waypoint, type /-4, and that is going to create a new waypoint on the final approach, exactly 4 miles from the runway. Like you can see over here, this Romeo Whiskey 201 point that I've just created on the 4-mile final. Now, when we want to fly the visual, we've got to make sure that the correct approach profile is also entered. So when we're creating it from the instrument approach, once we have created the waypoint 4 miles from the runway, we're just going to click the LSK on the right side of it, so that it copies the predicted speed and altitude at that waypoint. We'll insert it again to make it a hard restriction in here. Once this is done, we generally want to set up the LNAV path for our arrival. So what we're going to do here is we will enter a 4 miles base point. So we want a waypoint 4 miles into the north, somewhere over here, so that we get a nice base before joining the final approach. So we'll take this waypoint, and then let's have a look. We want to go somewhere to the northwest here, and there is a small trick to determine the track. We're looking at a final approach course of 213 degrees. If you just add 90 degrees to that, so it becomes 303 /4, because we want the 4-mile base. We'll insert this, and then we're getting a new waypoint over here. Now all we need to do is join the two up, and execute that. Now, from here on, we'll just take this waypoint, and as soon as air traffic control has cleared us for the approach, we'll fly direct to it. And let's quickly have a look what that looks like on the map. Execute. And here we are. This is our approach track for the visual approach. Come on. Here it is for a 4-mile final. And the big benefit of doing it this way is now we have LNAV and VNAV guidance available, and we can use the autopilot to fly ourselves onto the final approach in order to achieve a stable approach. While at the same time, the pilots have less workload, so we are able to look outside and verify terrain clearance, look for other traffic, etc. So this is how to do it when there is an instrument approach available in the FMC. However, there are runways where there is no instrument approach available. And let's quickly have a look at how to enter a visual approach on those. We go into the departures arrival page, select arrival, and then we go all the way forward until we just have the runway here without any approach. So we want to take runway 22. And now you can enter an extended center line over here. So we can say, for example, we want 4 miles. Keep in mind, 4 miles is the minimum. And we want a descent angle of 3 degrees. And with this entered, the FMC is going to generate an RX point, which is basically a runway extension point, on the final approach over here, exactly on the runway center line, 3 miles out. 4 miles out, of course. Now once again, if you wanted to create the base, you'd select the RX point, take the track, add 90 degrees to it if you're coming from the north, or subtract 90 if you're coming from the south, to create your base point. So what's it here, 216, so 306 / 4 miles. Put it in here, join it up, and there you have your visual approach in the FMC. Keep in mind, once again, to insert the hard altitude restriction at the waypoint, and that basically finishes your setup for the visual approach if there is no approach procedure available in your FMC. Alright, so this basically concludes the setup in case you do not have a runway waypoint available in the FMC. Now, keep in mind, you do not have a missed approach guidance available in this case, so it remains imperative that you agree on a missed approach procedure with air traffic control prior to commencing this approach. The big advantage, if you have chosen an instrument approach and amended that into a visual approach, is that you will have missed approach guidance and you can simply tell air traffic control, in case of a missed approach, we are going to follow the missed approach procedure of name the instrument approach you've used to set this up. Alright, we have made a small jump back in time, and I have re-entered the visual approach using the ILS approach for runway 22, as I showed you in the first example. And finally, in order to complete this visual approach, we have to set our minimums and then just quickly talk about the sequence of the aircraft configuration. So, the minimum for the visual approach is going to be our stable gate, so 500 feet since we are in VMC. Keep in mind, you can only execute a visual approach in VMC, so of course your stable gate is going to be 500 feet. So, to find out the airfield elevation to which we'll have to add those 500 feet, there's a small trick that I showed in one of my earlier videos. The runway waypoint has an altitude to it in the FMC, and that altitude is the airfield elevation plus 50 feet, because the FMC wants to overfly the runway threshold at 50 feet. So if you subtract 50 from that, we end up at 48 feet airfield elevation. Add 500, so our minimums is going to be selected to 548 feet. Once that is done, there is one final thing to keep in mind, and that is the aircraft's configuration. Since in a visual approach you will not normally be approaching from a straight center line, you will have to have a look at your distance from the airport and adjust the speed and altitude accordingly. Now VNAV is usually doing a great job in it, but we have to follow a couple of certain rules. On the progress page, you can see your remaining distance at all times, even though you may still have to fly turns, which may not make it as obvious how many miles you still have to go. So in here we have 23 nautical miles remaining towards our destination. Now, at 10 miles, you want to have at least flaps 1 extended, and even better, flaps 5, and reduce your speed to the flap 5 maneuvering speed. And that is going to help you in controlling the aircraft's flight path on the way to the final approach. And finally, you want to have the gear down with flaps 15 extended when you're crossing the 4-mile point. So don't just extend it when you cross 4 miles, as we would usually do in an approach in VMC, but much rather extend the gear and flap 15 by the time you start your turn towards the final. And that will also help with stabilizing the approach. Alright, now all things considered, let's finally start commencing our approach. And a final word here, you see we've entered the visual approach rather late, and this actually put us high on profile. So remember how I told you earlier on that we always want to set the visual approach up much earlier in our flight? That's exactly the reason why. However, we have to live with what we have, so let's unpause the simulator and start executing the approach. One final word here. In order to pause the simulator at the time where I'm recording this, there is a small bug in Microsoft Flight Simulator that actually makes the aircraft systems continue to run. And that's why I've disengaged autopilot and autothrottle in order to pause the simulator to give you my explanations. When I'm recommencing the flight, I will quickly have to re-engage autopilot and autothrottle, but that is simply due to a small simulator issue right now. When you are executing the visual approach in the ways that we've just briefed earlier on, you want to ideally keep the autopilot and autothrottle engaged for as long as possible, at least until you're established on the final approach course, since that greatly helps reduce your workload and improve your situational awareness. Alright, now everything's set and done. Let's continue our flight and do our landing in Pescara. So, autopilot, autothrottle, and we want to start our descent. Going to help it a little bit here using the speed brake. One final word for visual approaches, or two final words much rather. First of all, when you are conducting a visual approach at night, self-maneuvering is only permitted above the MSA. When you are below the MSA, you have to have electronic guidance available, be it in terms of a PAPI or in terms of, for example, a localizer and a glide slope. Just like we are doing on this approach, you can intercept an ILS visually by using the FMC to intercept the 4-mile point, and when you have an ILS available, like we do on this approach, then you can always use the approach mode in order to establish yourself on the final approach course of the ILS approach. Of course, during the whole visual approach you have to keep the landing runway in sight. So we know it is just over here. And I'm going to retract the speed brakes. Flaps 1. Oops. No, we don't want to increase that thrust. That was just my hardware jerking around, sorry for that. Re-engage the auto throttle. And keep in mind, looking at the progress page, we have 12 miles to go at about 3,000 feet, slightly on the fast side. So let's get flaps 5 out. So the energy monitoring is one of the most important things on this approach. We are using all the automatics here in order to help us guide the airplane down properly, but we have to keep in mind that we are still on a visual maneuver and we always have to monitor our aircraft's energy progress. Basically, VNAV is doing a very good job at it, but nonetheless we want to be sure to be on the safe side here. We actually fly the visual approach procedure just like any non-precision approach, so the NPA SOPs are going to apply, like I've shown you on my earlier ANAF or VOR approach tutorials. Terrain noted. Be aware that when you are conducting the visual approach, the runway waypoint, the waypoint 4 miles from the runway that we generated, will serve as our final approach fix. And since we're so close to our minimums by this point, let's just go ahead and reselect the missed approach altitude already. So that's 5,000 feet set, VNAV path, speed to that. Gear down, flap 15. So, turning final. You can see that since we have tuned the ILS, we do have full guidance available now, and we could use the approach mode if we wanted to. And flaps 30. Right, from here on, see the landing runway. Let's disconnect the automatics and make sure that we're getting down.
1,000.
Checked. In order to be allowed to turn onto the final approach course, you have to be within plus minus 400 feet of the VNAV path predicted altitude. Otherwise, the approach is prone to become unstable and therefore a go-around would be required.
Plus 100.
Checked.
Minimums.
Continue.
10.
The speed breaks up, thrust roll as normal. 100 knots. 80 knots. Manual brakes. Alright, this concludes our visual approach tutorial. I hope that you have found this useful. If you did, please leave a like and a comment, and if you really love my videos, I would appreciate a small donation through the Buy Me a Coffee link that I have put in the video description below. Thank you very much, and I'm hoping to see you all again on the next one.